Welcome to the IRS Debt and Audit Podcast with Brian Loughrin.
Hey everyone, welcome back to an all-new episode of the IRS Debt and Audit Podcast with Brian Loughrin. I am your host, Mike Leon. Brian here is a seasoned tax attorney based out in Tampa, Florida, and he's the founder of Tampa Tax Relief. And for more than 25 years, he's been helping individuals and business owners all across the country resolve serious IRS problems, from audits, tax debts, even cases in the U.S. tax court. Today, we're going to talk about the aforementioned tax court and what happens when your case goes there. Brian's going to walk you through what it means, how the process works, and why having the right legal representation makes all the difference in the world. Brian, it's good to see you as always. I don't think we've ever talked about the tax court part of this in any of these episodes, but for someone who's never heard of the U.S. tax court, what is it?
Really, the U.S. tax court is what they call a specialized court or special court that was created, actually started in 1924 through some Revenue Act. And then I believe it was 1942, it was changed to the United States Tax Court is a formal name. And then again, in the late 60s, they kind of revamped it, rebranded it as the U.S. Tax Court. But basically what it is just what it sounds like. It's a federal court for federal tax matters. And let's face it, the federal government runs on tax dollars. And so you're going to have a lot of disputes. And so much of what we do and what we've talked about to this point it's for the average person. I call the regular guy, regular individual, small business owner, which is defined as 20 million a year or less in revenue. But the U.S. tax court is there for people like the ones that we represent, but it's there also for some very large multi-zillion dollar type companies that are the slightest movement of a decimal can mean tens of millions of dollars. So it's for everybody, anybody and everybody.
Yeah. Well, 20 million in revenue. I don't know if you're part of the average Joe anymore, but we'll leave that there for a second. But Brian, how do cases find their way in the U.S. tax court?
Whenever there's a dispute, and whether it's a dispute of valuation or dispute of liability or any type of dispute between a taxpayer and the federal government, you certain appeal rights. And some of them are kind of, I won't say loose, but they're more informal, if you will, appeal rights. And you have a situation where you can talk to a manager, or you can file some type of request for appeals, the Office of Independent Appeals, and so forth. But at some point, if you're not getting the satisfaction that you want, you then go to the final level, so to speak, which is the U.S. tax court. Now, I just will say this, especially for anybody out there that is already familiar with tax court, and that is this: you do have the right to have the case heard in some cases, United States District Court or the Court of Federal Claims. But that's more fine line stuff. And again, that tends to be for much larger businesses, entities, or dollar amounts. But for our purposes, U.S. tax court is pretty much the final place to go to get your tax dispute settled.
And I just joked about it a second ago about 20 million and things like that. You gave that amount as kind of like the cutoff, but is going to tax court only for the people with large tax debts, or are there smaller cases monetary wise that are heard?
Well, the IRS, the U.S. tax court will hear cases involving any dollar amount. And sometimes you might even see a case that's very small, maybe even a few $100s, which people say, what's the point of spending all that time and effort, maybe attorney's fees and time away from work and so forth. But maybe somebody's trying to stand on principle. Maybe they're trying to set some type of precedent. But for the U.S. tax court, you have the option going in, depending upon the amount of or liability or assessment that the IRS is proposing or has levied, to if it's under $50,000, you can request it be handled as a small tax court case, or over $50,000, it's automatically handled as a large case, or you have the option of, at any amount, to have it handled as a large case. And the difference there is kind of procedural and evidentiary, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail about that, but I'll say this: I've never filed one as a small case, meaning I want to keep all avenues of evidence and procedure open for our clients. So that's just not an option I do. Some people do, and it's meant to be streamlined, but I think oftentimes that's for a situation where you might have one issue and not multiple issues at play, and for people that are maybe just representing themselves. So that's really the kind of the distinction that the U.S. Tax Court brings to it.
Brian, can I ask you, because you just mentioned the IRS, like how is going through the tax court different from dealing directly with the IRS or an appeals officer?
Well, the IRS has their own attorneys. It's called the IRS General Counsel's Office. And so they're the attorneys that handle the dispute from the federal government standpoint. And so you get to a point where you're dealing with the Office of Independent Appeals is the next highest level up from what I call the street level or local level, if you will. And some of the people in the Office of Independent Appeals are attorneys. It's not a question of that necessarily. It's just when you're dealing with the general counsel's office, it's a much more formal way of going about it. But when you get them involved, again, it's the U.S. Tax Court is handled by them.
Brian, can you kind of take us through the steps in the process once a taxpayer has actually filed a case in the U.S. Tax Court?
Well, just before you get to that point, what will happen is if you can't resolve the dispute at the administrative level, or just with the manager, or even just going up to the next level, then you're given a deadline. You're given what's called a notice of deficiency, NOD, and that basically says, and it's very clear to anybody who sees it, your option is either to agree with what the government's saying or file a petition, which is an action in U.S. Tax Court. That is a kind of a drop dead, one way or the other. And if you don't, then you've lost your opportunity to go to U.S. Tax Court. So in those situations, when you file a petition to go to U.S. Tax Court after having received a notice of deficiency, that doesn't mean that you're automatically going to find yourself in front of a judge wearing a black robe up on a bench. In fact, I would say 95% of the time, the case is going to get resolved even after filing a tax court petition without ever going to court. And so people sometimes back off a little bit when they call, and I'll say, well, the only option we have is to file a petition to go to U.S. Tax Court. And they're thinking, oh my gosh, going to court, and I have to miss work and get dressed up and all this kind of stuff and get grilled by a judge. I say, well, that may happen, but there's about a 95 out of 100 chances that it's not going to happen. But once you do that, then the case gets, an action gets opened, you receive a response from the U.S. Tax Court, and it's all online, it's all electronic, everything is submitted to Washington, D.C., and there's one central office for the U.S. Tax Court in D.C., and then the case is automatically sent to the Office of Independent Appeals, which may or may not be staffed by an attorney handling your case, and that is really the area that you are going to get the situation resolved, I say 95 out of 100 times, at least that's been my experience. And at that point, you might find that the IRS is more willing to see things not necessarily completely your way, but maybe a lot more your way than what you were dealing with at the local level. And that's just been my experience.
So Brian, that's great info. So 95%, they don't need to even go in person. The cases are handled remotely or in writing. And then the 5% means what about the case?
Well, the U.S. Tax Court, as I say, they only have one location. It's Washington, D.C. And yet when you file the petition, you mark a box where you want the case to be heard. And that's because the judges literally travel around the country hearing cases at, obviously, federal courthouses. Here in Tampa, there's one, Orlando, Jacksonville, and then anywhere in the country. And you just mark a box where if ultimately you're going to go in front of a judge, it's going to be in that setting. And so you have to pick a location, which obviously we picked Tampa. I did have a client one time that wanted a trip to Hawaii and thought he could write that off and mark Hawaii. And I said, I don't think that's a good idea. But anyway, we marked Tampa and got it resolved. But the judges then come around on a circuit, and it's not quick. Obviously, they have a certain schedule rotation, and you'll be notified of when a case is set, and then you're dealing with a court case in the same fashion you would any other type of civil action. You're given deadlines for discovery and so forth. So you're never going to have to go to Washington, D.C. per se, unless you choose to go there, or obviously if you want to take it past the U.S. Tax Court, which is going into the Court of Appeals, and worry about that right now. But it does work where it does come around to you.
Yeah. Well, I know why that guy was under tax investigation just based on that example. But let me ask you, because we didn't mention in your response there, how long does the court case take, like start to finish?
I would say, really, and it's a sense COVID, I would say realistically, from the time I file a petition to the time we get it resolved, you're potentially looking at 6 months, 8 months, a year. And sometimes it's the time of year. I had an agreed decision that came in, I think, the first week of December, and the attorney I'm working with in the general counsel's office said that we'll probably be looking to get the judge's signature sometime in March. So these are not fast cases. Um, Sometimes, if it's not looking like it's necessarily going to be a real good win for us, I can always suggest to my client, look, you can start paying some estimated payments towards the tax to help eliminate some of the interest and potentially the penalty. So you're not enjoined from doing that if you think, look, we might win something, because tax court doesn't always mean 100% win or 100% loss. Sometimes you go into it and sometimes they cut the baby in half, like Solomon, or other times you get a little bit more advantage than the government might have. So you do have the option to pay on a tax if you really think that you're going to owe something. But realistically, I tell people it's not a fast process. Just you could be looking at 6 months to a year. And if it gets done sooner, great. If not, at least they know it's going to take some time. And there's not a lot of activity. You can go months without any type of activity in a case like this. But when they do respond, you got to keep in mind you have certain deadlines that you have to adhere to.
Brian, can you kind of, for our audience, explain the role that someone like a U.S. tax attorney plays in the tax court versus compared to what a CPA or even an enrolled agent, would do?
Well, actually, you have to be admitted to the U.S. tax court. And so if you're an attorney in good standing in any state, you just simply file an application. They confirm you're in good standing. You pay the admission fee. I'm not sure what that is now. Not a great deal of money. And once you are admitted into the U.S. tax court, you're given a tax court bar number. So you have to include that on all the pleadings and so forth. And that gives you access to their website and the portals and things like that. So I do know you don't have to be an attorney to be admitted to U.S. tax court. I don't know all the procedures otherwise to do so. I know that I know one or two people that are admitted to the tax court that are not attorneys. They're not. In fact, one's not even a CPA. But I would say 99.9% of the people are attorneys. So it's just something that we have able to do very quickly, because a lot of times, people come to us right on receiving a notice of deficiency, or they'll say, I've got this thing. What is it? It's a CP 3219. Well, I know what that is. It's a notice of deficiency. And I'll say, what's the date on it? Please give me the date, because you have a 60-day window to file a petition. So a lot of times I tell people we need to get this thing filed within whatever amount of time that might be to preserve your rights. Otherwise, you're going to be saddled with this debt, and they don't want that. So as an attorney, you know that you have to really adhere to these deadlines. And CPAs and EAs understand that, but understanding the legal arguments is something that probably they're not able to do as well.
Yep. Something completely different. So, Brian, as we kind of put a bow here on this, for someone that's listening and they just got a notice about going to said U.S. tax court, what's the very first thing that they should be doing?
Well, give a call to our office. We offer a free consultation. If you have that notice in front of you when you call, it really helps. There's some dates and times and notice numbers and things like that may not mean much to people looking at it for the first time, but we can tell kind of where you are in the process and let you know if you still have a viable option for tax court, and if so, what might be in your best interest, one way or the other. And give a call. We'll go from there.
Give a call. We'll go from there. There's nothing to lose right there, right, Brian? So thanks as always for the time, the insights, and explaining this to the audience. I appreciate it, Brian.
Thank you, Mike.
That's it for today's episode of the IRS Debt and Audit Podcast. If you got that said notice that I just alluded to about the U.S. tax court, do not wait until the deadline passes. There are deadlines. Don't miss them. You could lose your right to fight the IRS. Visit Tampa Tax Relief or call Brian and his team over at 813-694-7177 to schedule that free consultation. Do me one more favor. Like, subscribe, leave a review, comment, share the episode with someone who's going to definitely ignore that notice. As always, I'm Mike Loughrin. See everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.